Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's LJC event with Carly. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Abby and I work with Barry Cranford. He is the founder of the LJC and I have the privilege of hosting today's event for you. The LJC is just one of 15 different communities run by RecWorks and growing. It's great fun. RecWorks are a tech recruitment company with a massive difference. So as a company, we believe that recruitment really can be a force for good in the industry beyond just placing people in jobs. We have a particular focus on learning, mentoring, and personal development. If people want to learn and others want to teach, we are more than happy to connect you through our communities and events. We see this as giving back to those we've worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. To date, we have run over 700 different events for engineers, developers, students, graduates, CTOs. We have run lightning talks, hackathons, mingles, presentations like this, all sorts. Earlier this year, we made our 4,000th introduction through our Meet a Mentor program, which is one of our 15 communities. We're really excited to see where that goes next and make our 5,000th introduction through that community, obviously. As I've already said, this is one of our events that gives us the opportunity for people to connect. That is something that we love to do. If you'd like to know more about any of our communities, please do get in touch with myself or Barry or Helen Lewis if you know her, and we can take it from there for you. The recording of today's session will be available on YouTube, and I will put the link in the chat later on for you. If you do have any questions while Carly is speaking, feel free to either unmute and ask, that's absolutely fine, or put them in the chat and we'll come to them as and when it's appropriate to do so. So I hope you really enjoy today's talk, and with no further ado, I will hand over to Carly. Over to you.
Hey, thanks, Abby. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see some friendly faces. And obviously feel free if you're having lunch, tea, whatever. This is all super informal, super chilled. I've got my tea as well ready to go. So my name's Carly Richmond. As Abby mentioned, I'm a developer advocate at Elastic. And today I'm kind of having a situation where two of my current career and my prior career kind of interlocked in a way. So before I joined Elastic, I actually worked in an investment bank for 10 years, mainly as a front-end engineer, but I tried on quite a few different hats to see what worked. But irrespective of my time in the bank, there was two questions really that I always struggled to answer. And it's actually in certain instances tended to be rather. The first question is, are my users actually using the features that I build? And two, are they actually getting a good experience out of using it? Particularly as a front-end engineer, I want to spread a little bit of happiness in the features I build. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why this is a difficult set of questions to answer. We're going to talk about some techniques I found over time that can help address that, along with some limitations of them. And as Abby said, feel free to chime in with any questions or any thoughts as we run through. As a disclaimer, when we come to some of the main tools, I will be making reference to the Elastic Stack and some of the solutions that we have, but I'll mention other alternatives along the way too, so that you just are aware of what kind of options you have when we get to those particular tools. Okay, so as I said, I used to be a developer. I worked in the bank for 10 years. And in that time, I worked probably like many in this kind of call today. I worked with a mixture of waterfall, I worked with some kind of Scrum, and I did a little bit of Kanban. And, you know, depending on the situation, some work better than others. But what I always found interesting is how we approach sprint reviews as developers, because using like my agile coaching hat, we often see anti-patterns of it being used as a demo rather than review, and then obviously developers will roll their eyes and we'll be like, yeah, but we're showing off what we do to try and get feedback. But the main problem I had was it was really similar to that kind of situation where you were given a gift at Christmas. Potentially that itchy jumper from like a relative. And you have to kind of smile and nod and say, hey, that's great. And in that regard, with some of the features, it was often quite difficult to determine if in fact we'd given something really useful, or if they were just kind of smiling and nodding along because they didn't want to hurt their feelings. And the reality is, if we have that kind of situation and we don't rely on other methods as well, such as quantitative measures, we end up in this feature factory mindset where we just keep going through that big backlog of to-do list, one thing after another. And personally, as a developer, I want to know that what I'm building is actually useful. And when you are building apps for an external facing organization or external clients, it's really easy because there's a monetary incentive. But if you're building applications for internal audiences, it's not always as clear cut. And sometimes trying to build these measures can be a little bit more challenging. And sadly, the situation I always see is it's only really when something goes wrong and we have to run to the bridge, or in this case, our laptop, and immediately start trying to figure out what has gone wrong because something's broken, that we really start thinking, I really wish I'd had some more quantitative way of addressing this problem. And that was my situation on and off for 10 years. So I'm going to talk about a story now where I really think that measures would have been useful. And it was the kind of first point where I started to realize that I couldn't just rely on qualitative feedback and the anecdotal, yeah, we're still using it from my users. So once upon a time, in a very large investment bank, we had a problem. We had this director that pulled up and he said, you know what, I'm getting some weird feedback from the analysts on the desk. They're saying that this new stuff that they have to use because it's specific reason, the stuff that they have to use fundamentally is not being used and that they're having some performance issues with it. And I don't really know why. So myself and colleagues immediately jump into action onto the bridge, trying to figure out what's going on. We're scanning through server logs, we're trying to figure out if it's the front end or the back end where this kind of slowness is. And one of my colleagues pulls up something like this here. He pulls up the profiling dev tools within the Google browser and starts profiling your application. And then he starts using Google Lighthouse as well to run through some diagnostics. And we realized through using a mixture of these tools that in fact there's a slowness on the front end being caused by a massive amount of repaint events. And we hadn't been tracking anything over time. So when a big change went in, we didn't have any visibility on the performance impact it was going to have. And we therefore were like, okay, we need to fix this. Panic stations, let's deal with it now. And this was the first time that I learned about Google Core Web Vitals. So can I have some thumbs up or shows of hands? Has anyone used or heard of Google Core Web Vitals before? No, and that's cool because this is what this session is for. So Google Core Web Vitals, the initial set were announced by Google, as you can probably guess, in May 2020, and they're a series of metrics that are used to assess the user experience of your application. Now, for internal users and external users, they're still really important to the user experience. But if you are building a website for external audiences, anyone who's interested in search engine optimization, probably not developers on this call, but you never know, you should probably care about these because actually as of June 2021, they are included as a criteria in the search rankings of Google. So in addition to the user experience side of things, there's also an SEO side of things that you need to think about. Okay. So let me talk through the three main measures in as simple terms as I can and talk about where you should have these numbers if you start categorizing and using metrics yourself. So the first one, LCP, or largest contentful page. And this is basically the vendor time of the largest section, the main section within the viewport in the browser. So for example, if you have like the Run Records app that I had before, and it has a huge big image in the middle, that is going to be your main section, right? So it's the amount of time it takes for that to pop up, because that's an indication of how initially responsive your app is. We've all had that situation where something's not quite loading up, or we can tell something's taking ages, and we start to drum our fingers on the desk, like what is going on here? This is where LCP comes in. And ideally, you want your LCP to be under 2.5 seconds if you can manage it. The second one is what we call first input delay. And this is an indication of responsiveness for a user. So what I mean by this is basically from the time that they click to the time that the corresponding action is executed in the browser, that's the time window we're talking about, and it's the first one. So ideally, we want it to be within the 100 millisecond range, because as we all know from when we've used apps ourselves, and we are good indicators as engineers when we use apps and we empathize with that really bad experience. We know that if it's under 100 milliseconds for us to get a response to an action, we start thinking that something's gone wrong. And that's where people start clicking repeatedly, trying to confirm the action again and figure out what's going on. And I'm sure we've all been there as well, or we've had relatives that we've been helping through. I know that's a big one for me as well. And then the final one that's the main top three is what's called cumulative layout shifts. This one is a bit more difficult to get your head around. So if anyone wants more details, I can share some links at the end. But basically, this is talking about bursts of activity and movement within the layout on the screen. So it's how much things move. And ideally, you want a ratio of movement to be under 0.1. Now, you might think, well, why does it really matter if things are moving around? Well, if movement is categorized as being kind of connected to user error, right? So we've all had that situation where there's been two buttons really close side by side. Can you imagine if one of those moves and you click the wrong one and then suddenly you're paying for something that you don't want to pay for, or you've not added in your voucher code yet? That's really frustrating from a user standpoint. So knowing about cumulative layout shifts can have an impact on errors. So it's worth thinking about. So these three measures are great, and you can capture them in several ways. So I talked about Google Lighthouse and showed you it within the Chrome browser DevTools. But you know what? You can also use Google Lighthouse and plugins for CI to try and run these periodically so that you can see changes as your builds progress through over time. But to be honest, there's two limitations I see with capturing it using Google Lighthouse this way. The first thing, as is kind of implied by my original story, we caught the issue too late because we'd already had people on the phone telling us that stuff was broken. So it's never going to help you catch things early unless you put it into your CI pipeline. And even then, you're picking up as you're building the thing. So you're still going to have to do some retroactive work. The other thing is that, see, particularly when you're doing profiling, such as my colleague did, while it's a great thing, we are mimicking the events that we think a user is going to do. And I'm sad to say they don't always use things in the way that we intend. We've seen videos going around, and it's the one with I'm pretty sure it's a cable and it's people doing works, and the woman lifts it over her head instead of stepping over it, and everyone's like, oh, user behavior, they don't use it the way you expect it. It's sadly true. They don't use it in the way that you expect. And if you ever take time to observe your users using an action, you will see exactly that, because what you infer and what they infer might be different. So we need to remain nimble, we need to get moving, and we need to get measures in, stop relying on qualitative feedback. And this isn't a new thing that I'm talking about today, because many of the Silicon Valley giants that I have up here have been gathering measures and performing experiments for a very long time. The ultimate reason why Google has came up with these web vitals is that they don't have the ability to just hop downstairs and talk to Bill or whoever it is and ask them about the application. That's what I get for clicking back and forth. They don't have that. And that's a very privileged situation that I was in when I think about it. So we should be using these for internal audiences as well. Now, we are not always going to get it right. And we all know that Instagram didn't get it right very recently. And we know that they had to roll things back. But we should still hunt for these things. We should still try and find this out using these metrics. But the problem is that, particularly for internal audiences, it can feel a bit like we're spying on our colleagues, and that doesn't normally go down very well. So has anyone heard of the term bossware at all? Nah, that's fine. I'm hoping you haven't heard of the more formal name, which is employee monitoring software. But basically the idea of this stuff is this is the kind of things that kind of through the pandemic and afterwards have gotten a lot of bad rep because they break trust between employers and employees, because they basically watch what you're doing. So these are the kind of applications that can tell that you've been spending X amount of hours in Google Chrome, trying to infer that perhaps you're spending more time on Facebook rather than looking up Stack Overflow or other tech blogs. Or it might be simple as the door entry systems or the tools that are tracking your card logs as you go into a building, for example. Those things make you feel like you're not trusted at work. So whenever we talk about monitoring, we need to think about that and try and anonymize as much as possible. Otherwise, people might be afraid to use our stuff if they know that we're monitoring their activities. And when I have this conversation with people, they say, well, let's not monitor it then. Let's try and do something artificial to see that something's still available. So then I start talking about synthetic monitoring. Has anyone used any synthetic monitoring before? Yeah, totally cool. That in itself could be a whole other talk. But synthetic monitoring you might have used without realizing. So what it is basically it's the ability to automate either user clicks or accesses to endpoints programmatically, and then run them at a set period to verify that your application is alive and well. So it kind of comes from more of an observability side of things than a usability side of things. Now, for example, you might have used tools like Playwright or Selenium. These are examples when you plug them into a synthetic monitor, can be run periodically to verify the activity. But even then, similar to that profiling argument I talked about before with my former colleague, those things still are what we expect a user to do and not necessarily what they actually want to do. So we want to try and find a way with relative anonymity to try and see what our users are doing, to diagnose their problems, and to make sure that they have a reasonable experience, and also find out if they're using our application. And you know what? I've found this. Oh, there we go. So this is the part of my story that gets a bit wacky. We knew back in my time in the bank that we needed some form of application or something in order to monitor what our users were doing in an anonymized way. But we didn't have access to another tool that I'll talk about at the end. We did look at some internal tools that were available to see if they could actually, categorize and capture some of this information, because we just wanted to know simple view counts, right? But the problem with that was that there was one third-party tool that was available in the bank that was ridiculously expensive. And therefore, trying to justify to use that to internal audiences is really, really hard. And you know what? The second reason was that we didn't have any other kind of monitoring tools. So we decided we were going to build our own. And we enlisted in the help of an intern so that we didn't have to justify building monitoring for our users, because it could be a cool intern project. And we came up with something like this. If this will move on, there we go. This is not a complex architecture. This is something that you will probably have built for other use cases before. So what you can see is that we had a JavaScript library that basically would be responsible for triggering events of saying you clicked on this particular page, clicked on this button. These events would then be sent to a service. This could be written in anything you like, Java, Node, whatever. And then that basically spat out the information into a log file, which then we sat a simple visualization dashboard on top of. This is where you're getting into situations of potentially being able to use Splunk or Splunk Dashboard or Kibana or anything like that. And it wouldn't necessarily need to be a log file either. We use this for convenience, but arguably it could be an Elasticsearch cluster, it could be a database, anything at all you like. But there's two problems with what was done here, thinking in hindsight. The first thing is, this is obviously reinventing the wheel, as you will come to find out. And the second problem is that it doesn't actually integrate well with existing observability tools that are used by SRE groups, observability engineers, or even support teams within organizations, because they will want to know that information for a very different reason. They'll want to think about it for figuring out uptime, figuring out if they need to scale for particular events, looking for patterns. And this data can be used for these two reasons. So let's try and use the same tools. And this is where rum comes in. Now, it's obviously afternoon now, but it is a working Tuesday, so not so socially acceptable. But real user monitoring, or RUM, is basically a set of tools embedded within observability technologies that allow you to capture real user behavior in a periodic sample, and that you can have particular dashboards or capabilities sitting on the top to see Google Core Web Vitals, other measures, access history, traces, all these other things. It's obviously a key thing in the observability side, thinking about front to back monitoring of all layers of an application. But we can also use it to answer some really simple questions about the availability of services, figure out if our users are really using it, and also try and find out what their experience is actually like. This is roughly what the architecture looks like for most of the main RUM products out there. This is the Elastic-specific one, but anyone who's used anything else, Datadog, whatever, this will probably look quite familiar. So you've got here a RUM agent that's running alongside your JavaScript front-end library. And that is basically agent is going to run alongside and capture and sample key events that are happening in your application. You have to do some basic instrumentation. I've got a code sample in a minute to show you how to do that. But aside from that, you don't need to do too much. If you're wanting to do, Java backend instrumentation, or indeed Node or whatever, you've got two options really. The first is you can use something called an APM agent. These are normally very vendor specific. But basically, this will work similar in terms of being able to capture key information and traces for what is happening in your backend services. This is the other way to do it. Does anyone recognize this symbol at all? It is really small, so it's okay to say that. So this is OpenTelemetry. It's an open standard for being able to capture traces. And indeed, Elastic and most other vendors do support the ability to send via OpenTelemetry. Obviously, the advantage is that this is relatively agnostic, so that obviously you can switch your consumers if you need to. And it seems to be the way that things are moving forward, and speaking to a lot of people in the industry as I do. So the data has to go somewhere. And in this case, what happens is it gets sent to the APM server, which is present either within the Elastic cluster if you're using cloud, or it'll be your own if you're running on-prem. It gets ingested into an Elasticsearch, and then obviously you will have the Kibana dashboard sitting on the top. I'll show you some screenshots later on of how some of those look out the box. But of course, you could build your own, because once the data is in Elasticsearch, you can pretty much build all the visualizations you would like in Kibana as you see fit. Okay, let's talk about the code then. It wouldn't be one in the Java community without taking some code. Okay, so this is how you initialize the RUM agent. So it's really super simple. You basically initialize it with the service name, which is what will show up within your Elasticsearch, obviously. I'll talk about distributed tracing origins in a minute. You then have your server URL, which is basically going to be your Elastic deployment. So this is the APM server that we talked about. Then you will have a service version and an environment. So obviously environment is important if you're sending multiple environments worth of data. This will allow you to categorize the different environments. Now, in terms of the npm install, you basically install the Elastic APM RUM agent. It's pretty straightforward. If you're using other frameworks as well, so for example, React, Angular, and Vue, if you're wanting to capture some kind of framework-specific things, such as some of the routing and stuff like that, you might want to also look at installing the wrappers on the top. But to get it basic up and running, pretty much all you need is the Elastic APM I've got here. Now, if you want full service maps to be able to see front to back, so being able to pick up your front end calls and your back end calls through the traces the whole way through, this is where distributed tracing origins comes from. It's basically saying, can I get around the kind of core side of things to say, look, this is going to be the corresponding back end that my traces are going to go through, so it's permitted, and make sure that it's got the traceable headers on there. So that's the reason why distributed tracing origins has been included, because obviously I'm showing you here a full front to back example. Now, in Java, there are 3 ways to do this, just to be complicated. The first one, which is the one I've got here, is the manual setup, which requires a code change. So what you're going to see is that basically I've got the Elastic APM attacher, which is obviously included in my Maven configuration, and then I will attach the process running to my main, and that's pretty much how it's picking things up. If you don't want to rely on a code change, you can either use the APM agent attach CLI jar in order to automatically attach, or you can use the Java agent option as well when you're running your process. So those 3 different options. I can send you on the documentation later if anyone's wanting to go through that in more detail. And then the properties are really similar. So if you're using the manual, it will look for elastic apm.properties. So as long as you've got this properties file within the Java project, you can pick it up. Obviously, you can pass these in as well programmatically, but I do like the separation of project files personally, which is why I put it in here. And I guess the last thing to note, these things probably all look really similar to the RUM example we talked about before, but for the APM, you will require a secret token. You will get this token from your Elastic instance. And then obviously I've specified rather the application packages here. Now, if anyone wants to dig into the code any further, you scan that QR code there. I can also send out the code repo link afterwards if anyone wants it too. Now, I mentioned that OpenTelemetry was the other option. Again, check out the OpenTelemetry site. They've got some really good examples for basically all of the different agents that they have, how to get started, the automatic versus the manual option, really similar to how APM works. But basically what you specify for OTel is your service name, version, and your environment are under the OTel resource attributes. And then you still have your endpoint being the APM server. Your token is coming through from the authorization headers, and then you specify each of your exporters as OTLP. And this will be for your 3. So the 3 main things that we capture under OpenTelemetry and within observability is metrics, logs, and traces. So it will cover all of these. And then obviously when you come to run things, then this is specifying the Java agent option just to show you kind of how these different examples work. Does that all make sense? Cool. I see notes. That's good. So now that I can go back in time. If I could, if I had a lovely time machine like Martin McFly, yeah, not quite the dream car DeLorean, but certainly like the tech going back in time thing. So if I could do that, if I could go back in time, I would do something very different. I wouldn't have built my own. And you know what? I would have been able to answer not just those 2 questions I talked about at the start, but I would have been able to find out some other interesting things about how my users were actually using the features that I built. And that's what we're going to talk about for the remainder here, just kind of sharing some examples of the different measures that come out when you're using RUM and APM together that can help you when you're having issues determining if features are really as effective as you think they are. So back to being slow, okay? That initial story that I kicked things off with. So I used to always get these issues first because in the minds of my users, the front end was always where the problem is. It didn't matter whether it was the front end or the back end, and that's why we had that scramble, try and figure out where the problem actually was. So if I did have my time machine and I could put instrumentation on the top, I would have been able to do it on the actual user activity itself in production. We wouldn't have had to have replicated it using Lighthouse or any of the profiling tools. So all RUM tools will give you access to those core web vitals based on the production traffic that you're monitoring. They'll give you the other metrics that come through. These are all captured using Google Lighthouse if you use it. So that would have been really useful. And you know what else would have been great? I would have been able to see where my slowness was to some degree. So as you can see here from this sample trace I've got up, and you can see that everything in green is referring to the UI. So a lot of the time is taken actually in terms of loading up the initial JavaScript files. So maybe there's some optimization I could do there. And then obviously you can see towards the bottom, Nice go. Towards the bottom, the blue line, record controller, get record by query, that is the actual Java call. That's the controller call that's actually getting the data back. And you can see comparatively, it's not actually taking that much time at all. Sadly, I used to get conflicting accounts by users, always fairly innocently. I don't think it was out of, malice, but sometimes I would hear, yeah, I'm totally using that. That feature's fab. And then maybe a few weeks I'd speak to someone else and they'd be like, yeah, that's fab. And then I would speak to someone else and say, oh no, I've never used that. And in big organizations, it's so easy to do, sadly, because people just find whichever way they can get their job done. And if that means using the same Excel spreadsheet that they've used for several months or several years, even with a new feature coming in, they will still do that. So we just want to have a simple way of saying, actually for certain that they're using it. They will give you page views over time. All of these dashboards that are giving you RUM capabilities will do that. So I can see here really easily in the highlighted illustration over time, the total number of page views. You can also break it down sometimes by other attributes, depending on the provider you're using. But just having something basic as being able to see over a time period how often it's being used can be useful. And then you can start to look and establish patterns. Are they only using it at monthly reporting cycles or yearly? Are they only using it at bank holidays? And these can also be useful insights for determining the effectiveness, and also making sure that as you're measuring your effectiveness that you don't start getting into traps of thinking, oh, they're not using it, but actually they're using it once a quarter. I've had a lot of situations where, kind of similar to the age-old joke of technologists of, well, it works on my machine. Sometimes it doesn't work in someone else's browser. And the one particular story I have to highlight this is that I had a former colleague who contacted me saying, look, this is showing a black screen for me, Carly. It was this lovely metrics dashboard that we built out some time before. And we'd had good feedback, actually good feedback from users. And we knew they were using it because they were sharing some interesting insights on it. But she couldn't see it. And we didn't know why. So I couldn't get that much information out over the phone. So since it was local, I actually went and popped over at 8:30 in the morning with my coffee, because us developers don't tend to like early mornings anyway. And I went to just go and see what she's doing, just to try and find out if I could solve the problem. And I found out that she was using Internet Explorer. Yes, I can feel the sigh. She's using Internet Explorer. And I was able to, now that I could see really quickly, I could see that it didn't work for Internet Explorer. And it was down to a particular cookie setting she had as well. So once I managed to sort all that out, ta-da, it appeared. And if I just had the breakdown, I would have been able to see what she was using, because not all, I think it's less of an issue now, but I'm pretty sure we've all had that conversation, maybe with a parent or someone, where they're having an issue with a site and they're just like, oh, I opened up the internet, because they think that the browser is just the gateway to the internet. Does anyone out of curiosity still need to support Internet Explorer? I've just been doing this as an interesting poll while I've been doing this talk. No? Lucky people. I actually did this last week at Lead Scotland, and there was one person in the audience that still supported Internet Explorer. So we need to send some happy thoughts to that person. But having this information is also useful to know if you need to deal with things like multi-device support. Of course, you make for external facing applications, that seems like a really obvious thing that you need to also support mobile. But for internal audiences, that's often, especially regulated environments, that might be a bit more of a difficult question. And you know what? I would have been able to see that error that had popped up on our screen without having to try and explain how to open up the developer console and look and log. So what you can see in here is this is a very uninteresting error. There isn't actually much in terms of a stack trace, but there's additional metadata for it. So I can see the browser, I can see it's off the back of a click event. And if you use something called source stacks, you can actually do some cool things where you can have the basically deminified source files as well for your JavaScript. So you can actually see where the error actually hits in terms of the trace within this stack trace view, which is kind of a nice thing to do as well, but I don't have that here, sadly. So the last one I have today is the opposing argument. Has anyone had to ever switch something off? I've had to do it once in my career. I've had to switch something off. And it was really tricky because I'd kind of learned from colleagues who'd had to switch things off before, where you think no one's using it, and then you get that frantic call or the emails start running through on the Monday morning after you switched it off, saying, I can't do this, I can't run this, what's going on? It's like, well, we switched it off over the weekend, we didn't think anyone was using it. It's actually really hard to figure out if people are not using something prior to switching it off. So the situation I faced was that we had an application that was just really old. It was aging. The front end was not Windows 10 compliant. It was going to be significant effort to actually bring it up to speed. And we didn't want to invest the effort, so we wanted to see if we could switch it off. Now, I had assurances from all the regional leads. This has definitely not been used in a long time. But I then checked I had to actually scrape the network access logs for the executable for the front end to find out that it was being used in North America on bank holidays. Because I had to check for that longer time period, and it turned out that they were indeed using it. And then we had to have a conversation, because the other regions were trying to figure out if this was a process that could be adapted, could they all follow something similar, or did they really need to use this particular application? And thankfully, they ended up mirroring the process for the others, so I got to switch it off, and that was actually really satisfying. So normally we think about page load duration by region, right? We think of that as just a useful thing for potentially determining latency and for figuring out, actually our users within a particular part of the world are not getting the best experience, and we then think about, perhaps scaling or where we're actually hosting our services, all those things. But being able to just simply see where they are is actually really useful, and would have been really useful for this story. Now, remember I talked about the anonymity side of things? This, in the last example, kind of does break it. So we do need to be careful, but these are still use cases that can potentially come up that can be solved using Run. So we've talked about a lot today. We've touched on briefly on synthetic monitoring and what it is. We've talked about all the Google Core Web Vitals and the measures. And we've talked about real user monitoring and how all these things relate and how these can be used for answering if our applications are being used, but also if users have a good experience with them. But with great power and knowledge of these metrics comes great responsibility. This is not meant to be a tool for finger waggling and saying, you're not using this and I want to know why. It should be noted that it's the application that's under scrutiny here. There's clearly a reason why users will not be using things, and it's simply for a case of trying to find out in order to make the application better. So please do use these measures wisely. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm happy to take any questions that pop up. Otherwise, you can feel free to DM me at Carly L. Richland on Twitter. The code snippet's there as well at the QR code. Otherwise, feel free to ping me on Slack and the LJC as well. I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carly. That was fascinating. I'm sure everybody else found it really interesting as well. So we have had a few questions come through in the chat. So let's have a little look. How did you manage the overhead of sending the tracing data to the server, and how often do you push the information?
That's a good question. So it actually depends on the sampling, if I remember correctly, of how often it's actually sent, both in terms of elastic run and in terms of elastic APM. If you're interested, I can try and pull out the sampling docs that we have for Elastic, and it gives a bit more information about head versus tail sampling options, because head by default pretty much sends everything. Meanwhile, tail kind of tries to be a bit smarter and figure out which event should be sent. So that's kind of the way to try and kind of, decrease the load and things like that. But obviously, in terms of the Elastic Cloud and stuff, it should be pretty scalable. Obviously, Elasticsearch is used to getting in large volumes, so that hopefully should not be an issue.
Excellent. So did you have to rely on the DOM tree, the DOM tree for your solution, or did you, or tweak the front end application to meet the metrics based on events?
So Alan, I'm assuming that is the build your own approach that you're talking about there. So did not rely on the DOM tree. It was actually, basically the way it worked was that it hooked into the Angular, because everyone was using Angular in that team. So for getting the basic boots, it hooked into the Angular booter, and it basically figured it out that way. But for custom events like button clicks and things, actually the way it worked was that you would basically add the line of code in your callback function in order, you're kind of like producing like a custom trace in a way. And that basically meant that it would trigger back and send whichever message you want back. So the solution wasn't smart enough to say, oh, something has changed in the DOM tree or something has clicked and I would send information. It wasn't smart enough. It was relying on you adding the line of code.
Excellent. And there's a couple more questions still here as well, which is great. So for the Web Vitals metrics and SPAs, how have you worked around the fact that Google collects the data only for the first load on SPAs? Did you have to create your own flavor of Core Vitals to work with your applications?
Right. So we didn't. So for the original kind of bring your own, we didn't collect the SPAs. So you're right. That limitation of, unless you do funky things with the Lighthouse recorder to record a full time span, which you can do, you're right, it only collects from the first page of an SPA. But for the Elastic side of things, I mentioned that there are frameworks. So framework wrappers that sit for Angular, Vue, and React, that basically try and integrate into the routing, and that means that you should have less of an issue, and it will pick up the distinct routes and therefore be able to calculate an SPA on each page, if that makes sense.
Cool, thank you. So Chris has a question next, so over to you, Chris.
Hey, yeah, thanks for the talk, Carly. It was really useful. Just wanted to ask about the service versions attribute that I saw was on the attributes that were passed to the agent, the user agent. I was eager just to learn a bit more if you have any examples of that being used in CI pipelines. Obviously in the examples you're just setting service version to 1, but I wonder if there are any real life examples of being able to increment that and then use that to diagnose errors between versions.
So what I have seen in the Elastic docs, and I can maybe send it on if it's of interest, is just having, because obviously you're right, if you're building your own versions, you don't want to have to increment it automatically in configuration or anything. You want to just pick it up. I have seen a code snippet, a node code snippet, which basically will get the version from the code version itself, I think the file system or the memory serves. I can ping that on. So what basically you would do is within your kind of initialization, you would probably have a variable that you're passing in, and you will use that scripting step in order to pull the version, and then obviously put that in for your service version attribute. I mean, you can technically leave it out, but obviously the advantage, because it's an optional attribute, but one of the advantages that it will basically allow you, it kind of tracks things better within Kibana and stuff like that. So what I would suggest is, programmatically calculating it and then putting that in. And I've seen similar things for service maps as well. You want to version your service maps, and that's the other thing. If you use the tracing, is that the service map needs to match the trace captured that service version, otherwise it won't connect. So that's another thing to be careful of as well.
Awesome. Is it possible to also have front end and back end versions separately, I assume?
Yeah, they're both. So the service version for the back end being instrumented by APM is different to the one on the front end. So it's each individual component.
Nice. Thank you.
Of course.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Carly? I'm going to take that as a no. You were obviously very comprehensive. Thank you.
Cool. I mean, if anything
great.
pops up afterwards, people feel free to contact me if anything else pops up.
Yeah, fantastic. So all that is left for me to say today then is thank you so much, Carly, for coming and sharing some of what you know. We love hearing different things from different people, and it's great to continue our learning journey as well. So thank you so much for taking the time out to come and speak to us. And thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed that. It looks like you have, because I'm getting loads of thank you so much, Carly. That was great in the chat. So that's amazing. You should all have the YouTube link because I've sent it to you for getting the video later on if you want to rewatch this at any point, and we really look forward to seeing you at our next LJC event as well. Thank you so much for your time and have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye.